Okay, so if you're watching this video, you are probably feeling like you need a little extra help getting started on your intro paragraph. So hopefully this will help. If you're at this point in the writing process, you have set up your document to look something like this, and you're also going to need a couple other things open. So follow me here. You should also have your essay assignment document open, and in that, if you're ready to start actually writing your paper, you should have your outline completed. So you should have all the information, all the research you feel like you need. You might not actually end up using all of it in your paper, but it should all be laid out in sort of the order you plan to use it. And then one other really helpful thing to have open, if you go to your research paper writing dashboard, which you probably have open if you're already at this video, if you go down and click on the model research paper about Mary Fisher, having that model as sort of a reference should also be really helpful in writing your paper. So if you don't have all those things open yet, pause this video now and make sure you've got all of them. You've got the model paper, you have your essay outline ready to go, and you also have your new blank essay document. Okay, if you're ready to go, then I'm going to press Tab. That's the button right above the Shift key, and we'll get started. I'm going to start with my hook. I'm going to jump over to the sample and sort of see how this does it. So Mary Fisher was the daughter of a wealthy and powerful Republican. She was HIV positive. Then it goes on to actually give a pretty powerful quote that she said during the speech. So this one doesn't actually start with a quote. You don't need to. Like, the really impressive information about this speech, or what makes it so memorable, partly was that Mary Fisher was HIV positive, though she wasn't sort of the stereotypical person that you would expect to have HIV. You might have a really powerful speaker or famous speaker that you actually want to highlight. Maybe it's Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, and you want to start with that instead. If I look at my outline, I made the decision that I wanted to focus on this famous line from JFK's inaugural address. So I'm just going to copy and paste that, and gonna put it right here. Just a little warning, if you're copying and pasting like that, you can see that this is actually in Georgia font. At the very end of writing every section, I'm going to want to highlight and make sure this is changed back to Times New Roman. Okay, so we can deal with that at the end. So I've got this quote. This is what I want to use as my hook. Here's another thing. If you are using a quote as your hook, you need to give some context for it. You can't just start your paper randomly with a quote, not giving your readers any understanding of where it's coming from or what the context was. So I'm going to lay a little context before this. So I basically want to say that JFK said this, and I probably want to tell you where and when he was saying it, which is interesting because, I mean, in the intro paragraph, that's sort of what I have to do anyway. So I might get some of this stuff, the background, done actually as I introduce this quote. So for instance, where and when he delivered it, he gave it in 1961. It was his inaugural address. He delivered it outdoors at the Capitol building on a bright and bitterly cold day. Okay, here's one thing. As I sort of use these words, I'm probably not going to say bitterly cold day. That's not really my wording. So I got to make sure that I don't just use this source M. Nelson's words. I got to rephrase it a little bit. Okay, so let's go. Let's say on the morning, was it morning? Do I know that? It doesn't really say that, so I'm not going to say that. I don't know that. Let me just give the date. On January, let's see, January 20th, 1961. And actually, maybe I want to set the scene a little bit more. I know that it was really cold, so maybe I'll say it was cold, but I'm not going to say bitterly cold because I probably wouldn't say that. So on a cold January 20th, 2H, 1961, John F. Kennedy stood before a crowd on the steps of the Capitol building. Okay, So they capitalize capital. I think I need to do that. Let's see if there's anything else I want to include in there. I might add that it's in Washington, D.C., because I know that it is. So, on a cold January 20th, 1961, John F. Kennedy stood before a crowd on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and spoke the famous words. And then I'm gonna just go straight into the quote. My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And right now, I will need a citation for all this, but I'm going to say that for another video. So, let's see. What have I done? This is your process. So once you've got that hook done, and if you haven't, pause right now and do that same process for your hook. You may have to introduce a quote. You may just be having to introduce your speaker or the topic that they're speaking on. If you're ready to move on, I'm now going to sort of check to see what things I've gotten done, and I'm actually sort of going to check them off by highlighting them. So it's just my method. So I have, oops, that's not what I would do. Okay, so I've done the hook. I've also covered, yep, I know that it's JFK, so that's done. And I also got the date. And I told you where it happened, so I've got this, used it, done. And what do I have left to do? So I gave who, when, where. Oh, I haven't done audience, so I need to do audience, and then all I have left to do is add my thesis. You should go through this same process. So check your hook right now and highlight any parts of this information that you need to present in the intro paragraph that you've already done. Okay, so if you've done your highlighting, then let's move on to any parts that we still have left to introduce in terms of background information. So I have to talk about JFK's audience. Okay. I'm going to say when Kennedy, I don't need to use his full name anymore now that I've introduced him once, just use his last name. This is an error that a lot of students make. Don't call your speaker by their first name. You don't know them. This is a formal paper. Call them by their last name. So when Kennedy, I'm going to reference, I just talked about him speaking these words, so I think I'm going to connect it and say when Kennedy spoke these words, and I guess I haven't said yet actually that this is his inaugural address. I mean, it's in January on the Capitol and he's the president, but let me say that. When Kennedy spoke these words as part of his inaugural address, he was both speaking to the American people as well as, and this is something I already remembered, but if I remember correctly, so he spoke to local Americans, but he also realized that there was mass media, so television, radio, and this meant that what he said would be seen, heard, and reported everywhere in the world. So I'm not going to directly quote that, I'm just going to sort of say that he knew that he was talking to a bunch of different people. And here this gets into the different audience he actually had, or where he had referenced them in his speech. He talked to every nation, these new nations, those living in huts and villages, so people who are not in as developed of nations across the world, with sister republics south of the border, so he's talking to, for instance, Cuba and other southern nations. He's talking to the United Nations. Okay, so he's talking to many different people across the globe. I don't know if I'm going to list all of them in this intro paragraph, but figure out for yourself who are the audience members that you need to talk about. You might think about whether your speaker, like Kennedy, has an audience who's actually physically in front of him, but whether they may actually also be speaking to a more broad audience. Like Kennedy, he's speaking actually not just to those Americans in front of him, but to the entire world, because he knows that different people around the world will see this on TV and hear it. So I'm going to just basically say that here. When Kennedy spoke these words as part of his inaugural address, he was both speaking to the American people as well as to people, maybe audiences around the world. So I'm going to go into a little bit of what this was saying. Basically that he was aware that mass media, I think I'll just call it media, I would never say dawned, it hadn't dawned, it started, whatever. So I'll rephrase that. It meant that he would be seen, heard, and reported everywhere in the world. Okay. So let me see how this fits in. When Kennedy spoke these words as part of his inaugural address, he was both speaking to the American people as well as to audiences around the world. Kennedy was aware that due to the new media age, his speech would be on televisions and radios around the world. And his message, I'm going to connect this actually, because a lot of what he's saying is having to do with like this global Cold War. So, and his message would be directly targeted towards some of these international listeners. Because in fact, he doesn't really talk to Americans the entire time. So let me check that. When Kennedy spoke these words, he was both speaking to the American people as well as the audience around the world. Maybe just he sounds good. He was aware that due to this new media age, his speech would be on televisions, radios around the world, and his message would be directly targeted. And his message would directly target some of these international, maybe not some, just would target international listeners. So I always do this. I always reread what I've written, sort of make sure it all connects and makes sense before I keep on going to the next sentence. And actually, we go through this highlighting process. You should do the same. I'm going to just sort of check off the things that I've used. So, local Americans were no longer the only audience. Yeah, I did that. And I also talked to different segments. Sure, I've done that. And that leaves me with, in this section, all I have left to do is give my thesis. So I've decided I'm not going to get into all the little pieces of his speech he spoke, so I'm just going to leave that and copy and paste my thesis, which I'll have to make it not bold, and now that's messed with my formatting, but I'll deal with that in a second. So let's see if it flows together. He was aware that due to new media age, speaks to the televisions, and the message would directly target international listeners. Yeah, then it makes sense to say Kennedy's speech inspired Americans' hope in the future, but also established an aggressive Cold War stance that would lead to increased tensions with communist countries during Kennedy's presidency, and would go on to influence future United States foreign policy approaches for decades to come. And I like that that sort of connects to what I just said about he's talking to people around the world. It affects foreign policy. Okay, so now I'm going to go through this process you should always make sure you're doing as you go along. So I need it to not be bold. I need it to be 12-point font. I need it to be Times New Roman, and it needs to be double spaced, which is right there. Okay, so this probably isn't perfect, and I'm going to need to read it over a couple more times. Probably will wait to do that until I have more of the essay done, but that's sort of an approach that you can take to writing your intro paragraph, starting with each piece that you've laid out in your outline, and can use that strategy. I still need to bold this. This is a part that I've used, and actually I copied and pasted this from a website where it was already highlighted, so I should unhighlight that. But I've covered all, I now know that I've covered all these questions. I'll double check that one more time before I turn it in and I read it over, but I've included everything I need to in my intro paragraph, and I've presented my thesis statement at the end. So you can do the same. You can compare it to also this sample intro paragraph to give you another model. You can use this one as well. This document, if you want to take a look at it after watching this video, is going to be linked on, I don't think I have it open anymore, but it's linked on the bottom of your video dashboard. Thanks for watching, and I will see you later in the citation video.